You're living peacefully in your medieval village when suddenly dragon-headed ships appear on the horizon, and your entire world is about to end in the most brutal way imaginable. Within hours, you'll either be dead, enslaved, or watching everything you've ever known burn to the ground. Today, we're looking into the terrifying reality of why ordinary people had absolutely zero chance of surviving a Viking raid. Now, somewhere off the coast of Northumbria in the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne Monastery are going about their daily prayers, completely unaware that death is sailing toward them across the North Sea. These aren't just any ships approaching their sacred island. These are Viking longships, and the warriors aboard them are about to change the course of European history forever. But here's what most people don't understand about Viking raids. This wasn't random violence or mindless brutality. Every single aspect of these attacks was calculated, strategic, and designed to maximize terror while minimizing risk to the raiders themselves. The Vikings had turned warfare into a science, and regular people like you and me were nothing more than walking targets in their perfectly orchestrated campaigns of destruction. Let's start with the ships themselves, because without understanding these vessels, you can't grasp just how hopeless your situation would be. Viking longships were technological marvels that gave their crews an almost supernatural advantage over their victims. These weren't the clunky, slow vessels that most medieval societies used for trade. These were precision instruments of war, built for one purpose: getting warriors to their targets faster than anyone could possibly prepare for them. A typical longship could carry anywhere from 30 to 60 warriors, and here's the terrifying part. They could travel at speeds of up to 15 knots under sail, or maintain steady progress even in dead calm using their oars. But speed was just the beginning. These ships had an incredibly shallow draft, meaning they could navigate rivers and waterways that other vessels couldn't even attempt. While you're thinking the Vikings can only attack coastal areas, they're already sailing up rivers, penetrating deep into the heartland of Europe. Imagine you're a farmer living 50 miles inland, thinking you're completely safe from any seaborne threat. You wake up one morning to the sound of screaming from the next village over, and by afternoon, those same dragon-headed ships are beached right outside your settlement. This is exactly what happened throughout England, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms. The Vikings could strike anywhere, anytime, and disappear before any organized resistance could be mounted. Now, let's talk about the warriors themselves, because this is where your chances of survival drop from slim to absolutely zero. These weren't farmers picked up and handed weapons like the medieval levies that most kingdoms relied on. Viking warriors were trained from childhood in the arts of combat, and their entire culture revolved around the glorification of warfare and the pursuit of honor through battle. From the moment a Viking boy could hold a wooden sword, he was learning the fundamentals of combat: shield work, weapon techniques, formation fighting. These skills were passed down through generations like family trades. By the time these men were boarding longships for their first raid, they had already spent years mastering their craft. They understood spacing, timing, and the psychology of combat in ways that would take modern soldiers months of intensive training to achieve. But it gets worse for their victims. Viking warriors didn't just train individually. They fought as cohesive units with bonds forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. These weren't random groups of thugs looking for easy loot. These were military brotherhoods, often related by blood or marriage, who had trained together and raided together for years. They could coordinate their attacks with the precision of a modern special forces unit. The contrast with their typical victims couldn't have been more stark. When Vikings attacked a monastery like Lindisfarne, they weren't facing trained soldiers. They were attacking monks whose only weapons were prayer books and whose only armor was their faith. When they hit farming communities, they found peasants whose only combat experience might have been settling disputes with neighbors or driving off wild animals. Even when local authorities tried to organize resistance, the deck was completely stacked against them. Medieval levies, the peasant soldiers that made up the bulk of most armies, were exactly the kind of people you'd expect to die first in any serious combat. These were farmers, craftsmen, and labourers who might have been handed a spear and a wooden shield and told to stand in a line. Their equipment was basic at best, often consisting of converted farming tools and whatever scraps of leather or cloth they could find for protection. Meanwhile, the Vikings charging toward them were equipped with professionally crafted weapons and armour, wielded by men who had been preparing for this exact moment their entire lives. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. Picture facing a shield wall of bearded giants, many of whom stood head and shoulders above the average medieval European, screaming war cries in a language you don't understand, wielding weapons that gleam with deadly purpose. The Vikings understood something that their victims learned too late. Warfare isn't just about individual courage or even numbers. It's about preparation, training, equipment, and most importantly, the willingness to embrace violence as a way of life. While their targets were living peaceful agricultural existences focused on crops and crafts and community building, the Vikings were living in a culture that celebrated death in battle as the highest possible honor. This wasn't just about different fighting techniques or better weapons. This was a fundamental clash between two completely different ways of understanding the world, and one of those worldviews was perfectly designed to destroy the other. The religious beliefs that drove Viking warriors made them even more terrifying opponents than their physical advantages alone would suggest. In Norse culture, death wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, especially if it came in battle. They believed that warriors who died fighting would be chosen by Odin himself to join the ranks of the Einherjar in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. This wasn't just abstract theology. This was a practical worldview that created fearless fighters who would charge into combat situations that would paralyze normal people with terror. While you're standing there, trembling behind whatever makeshift weapon you've managed to grab, desperately hoping you'll see another sunrise, the Viking warrior advancing on you is genuinely hoping this will be the day he earns his place in the Hall of the Gods. But let's get specific about what would actually happen to you during a raid, because the reality was even worse than most people imagine. The Vikings didn't just show up and start swinging axes randomly. They had refined their tactics through generations of successful raids, and every aspect of their approach was designed to break their victims psychologically before the real violence even began. First came the psychological warfare. Those dragon heads carved into the prows of their ships weren't just decorative. They were terror weapons designed to announce exactly what kind of fate awaited anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. The sight of multiple longships appearing simultaneously on the horizon was often enough to send entire communities fleeing inland before the Vikings even made landfall. Then came the speed of the attack itself. Modern military strategists talk about the importance of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, and how disrupting your enemy's ability to complete this cycle gives you an overwhelming advantage. The Vikings had mastered this concept 1,000 years before it had a name. By the time you observed their ships, oriented yourself to the threat, decided what to do, and tried to act on that decision, they were already through your defenses and cutting down everyone around you. The actual combat was where your complete lack of preparation would become fatal in the most literal sense. Viking warriors fought in formation, typically using what they called the shield wall, a tactic that required extensive training and coordination to execute properly. Each warrior's shield overlapped with his neighbour's, creating an almost impenetrable barrier that could advance steadily forward while protecting the fighters behind it. Against this disciplined formation, individual civilians had no chance whatsoever. Even if you managed to get your hands on a real weapon instead of a farming tool, even if you summoned the courage to charge at these professional killers, you'd be facing not one opponent, but an entire coordinated unit working together to destroy you. And here's the truly horrifying part. The Vikings often didn't even want to kill everyone immediately. Dead people can't carry treasure back to the ships, and they can't be sold as slaves in distant markets. The most economically valuable outcome for a successful raid was capturing as many healthy adults and children as possible, while eliminating only those who posed a genuine threat or those whose deaths would maximize the psychological impact on survivors. This calculated approach to violence made Viking raids even more terrifying than random massacres would have been. They would systematically identify the most valuable targets: young women who could be sold as slaves, craftsmen whose skills were valuable, children who could be raised as thralls, while eliminating community leaders, warriors, and anyone else who might organise resistance. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 1793 demonstrates exactly how this played out in practice. The Vikings didn't just storm ashore and start killing monks indiscriminately. They targeted the monastery because it represented the perfect combination of wealth, defencelessness, and symbolic value. The monks had accumulated gold, silver, and precious religious artifacts over generations, but they had no military training and no weapons beyond whatever tools they used for daily labour. When the raiders landed on that sacred island, the monks probably thought they were witnessing the end of the world. These foreign warriors, speaking an unknown language, covered in battle scars and armed with weapons the likes of which the monks had never seen, systematically looted everything of value while demonstrating that not even the most holy places were beyond their reach. The psychological impact of that single raid echoed across medieval Europe for generations. If Vikings could attack Lindisfarne, one of the most sacred sites in Christendom, then nowhere was truly safe. The message was clear: your prayers won't protect you, your walls won't stop us, and your distance from the sea won't save you. So here's the brutal truth about why you die first in a Viking raid. It wasn't just about individual bravery or fighting skill, though those certainly mattered. It was about the collision between two completely different ways of life. On one side, you had agricultural communities focused on building, growing, and creating. On the other side, you had warrior cultures that had spent centuries perfecting the art of taking those creations away. The Vikings succeeded because they understood something that their victims learned too late. In a world where violence was always a possibility, the people who specialized in violence would always have the advantage over those who didn't. They turned raiding into a profession, warfare into an art form, and terror into a tool of conquest that shaped the course of European history. The next time you see a Viking depicted in popular culture as some kind of noble savage or misunderstood warrior poet, remember the monks of Lindisfarne. Remember the farming communities that disappeared overnight. Remember that for the people who lived through the Viking Age, these weren't romantic figures from ancient legend. They were the stuff of nightmares, and those nightmares were absolutely justified.